I stood in the back of the crowded conference room, my heart pounding so hard I was certain everyone could hear it. The PowerPoint slide displaying my patent application glowed on the screen, illuminating the skeptical faces of Meridian Tech's executive team. My boss, Richard Parker, stood at the front, his designer suit and polished smile a stark contrast to the contempt in his eyes. For 3 years, I'd worked as a software engineer at Meridian, quietly developing my ideas after hours while being overlooked during the day. Today was supposed to be different. Today was my chance. But as Richard's derisive laughter cut through the room, I realized this meeting wasn't going the way I'd hoped. Jessica's revolutionary gesture recognition system, he said, making air quotes with his fingers. Another impractical fantasy from our resident dreamer. He didn't know that in my bag was an email from Apple's acquisition team, received just this morning. They didn't think my idea was stupid. They thought it was worth $50 million. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The journey to this moment began 4 years ago. I was fresh, out of MIT with a master's in computer engineering and big dreams about changing how humans interact with technology. My thesis on intuitive gesture recognition interfaces had earned me honors and several job offers, but Meridian Tech had promised creative freedom and the chance to develop cutting-edge consumer products. It was a mid-sized tech company in Austin, with enough prestige to attract talent, but small enough that innovative ideas could supposedly flourish without bureaucracy. Richard Parker had been charming during my interview. "We're building the future here, Jessica," he'd said, leaning forward across his desk. "We need fresh thinkers who aren't afraid to challenge conventions." I believed him then. I didn't know that Richard's idea of innovation meant incremental improvements that wouldn't threaten the status quo or his position of authority. My first year at Meridian had been promising. I worked on their flagship smartphone companion app, making small, but meaningful contributions. The team seemed receptive to new ideas, and I felt valued. Everything changed when Meridian's main competitor launched a product with features similar to what I'd been advocating for months. Suddenly, Richard became obsessed with practical innovations and market-tested concepts. Creative thinking was now a liability. I still remember the first time Richard publicly dismissed one of my ideas. During a team brainstorming session, I'd suggested a new approach to user interface design that would make our products more accessible to people with motor control limitations. "That's nice, Jessica," Richard had said with a condescending smile. "But we're running a business here, not a charity. Let's focus on features our paying customers actually want." The room had gone quiet. Some colleagues looked away, uncomfortable. Others nodded along with Richard. No one defended me. That night, I went home and cried from frustration, but then something shifted inside me. If Meridian wouldn't develop my ideas, I would do it myself. I began working nights and weekends on my gesture recognition system. My concept was fundamentally different from anything on the market. A combination of camera-based tracking and ultrasonic sensors that could detect precise hand movements without requiring the user to wear any special equipment. The potential applications were endless, from smartphones and computers to smart homes, medical devices, and accessibility tools. For 2 years, I developed prototypes in my apartment's spare bedroom, converted into a makeshift lab. I maxed out 2 credit cards buying components and testing equipment. When friends invited me out, I declined. When family asked why I never visited anymore, I made excuses. The work consumed me, but it also energized me. Each breakthrough, each solved problem, was a small victory against Richard's dismissive attitude. The patent application process was arduous. I hired a lawyer with my savings, meticulously documenting every aspect of my invention. The initial filing fees alone cost me 3 months' worth of grocery money, but I believed in what I was creating. This wasn't just about proving Richard wrong anymore. It was about bringing something valuable into the world. 6 months ago, My patent was approved. I'd done it, secured legal protection for my idea without Meridian's support or knowledge. I hadn't told anyone at work, continuing to play the role of the diligent but unremarkable team member. I stopped pitching new ideas in meetings, instead nodding along with Richard's mediocre vision while my real work progressed in secret. Then came the email from Linda Zhang, head of acquisitions at Apple. She had somehow come across my patent filing and was interested in discussing potential applications. Our first video call lasted 3 hours. Linda asked incisive questions that showed she truly understood the technology's potential. For the first time in years, I felt professionally respected. Negotiations with Apple moved quickly. They were particularly interested in how my system could revolutionize accessibility features across their product ecosystem. The initial offer was $30 million, more money than I could comprehend. When they raised it to $50 million after seeing my latest prototype, I nearly fell out of my chair. The contract arrived in my inbox this morning. All I needed to do was sign, and my financial future would be secure forever. But I wanted one thing first: to present my idea to Meridian. Not because I thought they'd counter Apple's offer, but because I needed Richard to know what he had dismissed. I needed that closure before moving on. Which brings me back to this conference room, watching Richard ridicule 3 years of my life's work. The processing power alone would make this commercially unviable, Richard was saying, clicking to the next slide of my presentation with barely concealed impatience. Not to mention the battery drain issues, and the market research simply doesn't support consumer demand for this type of interface. He hadn't even bothered to understand how my algorithm optimized power consumption or how the ultrasonic sensors provided unprecedented accuracy with minimal energy use. He wasn't critiquing my actual work. He was dismissing the very concept of innovation that didn't originate from him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We appreciate your enthusiasm, Jessica, Richard continued, his tone making it clear he appreciated nothing of the sort. But Meridian Tech focuses on realistic, marketable solutions. This gesture system is, frankly, a fantasy. Several executives nodded along. Marcus Way, the CTO, looked uncomfortable but remained silent. Diane from marketing checked her phone, already mentally moving on to the next meeting. The project management team exchanged knowing glances as if to say, "There goes Jessica with her impractical ideas again." I stood up slowly, gathering my materials. My hands should have been shaking with anger, but instead, I felt a strange calm. "Thank you for your time," I said evenly. "I understand Meridian isn't interested in pursuing this technology." Richard seemed surprised by my composed reaction. He'd expected argument, defensiveness, maybe even tears. My acceptance confused him. "Well, good," he said, adjusting his tie. "I'm glad we're on the same page. Let's focus on the interface improvements for the next quarterly update instead." As the meeting dispersed, Marcus approached me in the hallway. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I thought your concept showed promise. The technical challenges are significant, but the potential applications are fascinating." I offered him a small smile. "Thank you, Marcus. That means a lot." "Richard can be set in his ways," Marcus continued, glancing around to ensure we weren't overheard. "Don't let today discourage you. Keep developing your ideas." "I will," I replied, knowing he had no idea how far I'd already taken this particular idea. Back at my desk, I opened the email from Apple and stared at the contract. $50 million. Financial independence, validation, all waiting for my signature. But something held me back. This moment felt too private for the open office. I wanted to savor it, to give it the gravity it deserved. I looked around at my colleagues, all unaware that their seemingly unremarkable coworker was about to become a multimillionaire. For 3 years, I'd been invisible here, my potential dismissed, my passion mocked. The irony wasn't lost on me that this invisibility had protected my invention, allowing me to develop it without corporate interference. Richard emerged from the conference room, laughing with the VP of sales about something. He caught my eye and gave me what he probably thought was an encouraging nod, as if to say, "No hard feelings about shooting down your ridiculous idea." Little did he know that idea was about to change my life forever. I made a decision. I wouldn't sign the contract today. Not yet. First, I would hand in my resignation letter tomorrow morning. I wanted Richard to wonder why I was leaving so suddenly. I wanted him to question what opportunities I might have found elsewhere. The full revelation would come later, when Apple announced the acquisition of my patent. By then, I would be long gone from Meridian Tech. That evening, I drove home in a daze, the events of the day replaying in my mind. The familiar streets of Austin looked different somehow, as if the city itself had transformed along with my circumstances. I pulled into my apartment complex, the affordable housing I'd chosen to maximize my savings for prototype development, and realized I wouldn't be living here much longer. Inside, I sat at my kitchen table, the contract open on my laptop. With a deep breath, I signed electronically, my name appearing on the dotted line like magic. I clicked submit, and just like that, my life changed forever. A confirmation email arrived seconds later, followed by a text from Linda. "Welcome to the Apple family, Jessica. We're going to do amazing things together." I allowed myself a moment of pure, unbridled joy. I danced around my small apartment, laughing and crying simultaneously. Years of doubt, sacrifice, and determination had led to this moment. My phone rang. It was my sister, Emma, the only person who knew the full extent of my secret work. "Did you do it?" she asked breathlessly. "I signed," I confirmed, unable to keep the smile from my voice. Emma's scream of delight was so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "I knew it. I absolutely knew you would change the world with this, Jess. When can I tell Mom and Dad?" "After I resign tomorrow," I said. "I want to do this right, one step at a time." "How did the presentation at Meridian go?" Emma asked, her voice softening. I sighed. Exactly as expected. Richard called it impractical, unrealistic, a fantasy. "What an absolute idiot," Emma said with characteristic bluntness. "I hope you're planning something special to rub his nose in it." I laughed. "I'm taking the high road." "The high road is boring." "The high road comes with $50 million, so I think I'll manage." After saying goodnight to Emma, I drafted my resignation letter. It was brief, professional, and gave no indication of my reasons for leaving or my plans for the future. 2 weeks' notice, effective immediately. I'd use my accumulated vacation days for the second week. As I prepared for bed, I thought about Richard's face when he eventually learned about the Apple deal. Would he regret his dismissive attitude? Would he recognize the talent he had stifled? Or would he convince himself that my success was a fluke, a lucky break unrelated to my abilities? In the end, it didn't matter. I hadn't developed my gesture recognition system to prove Richard wrong. I'd done it because I believed in the technology's potential to improve lives. The validation from Apple, one of the world's most innovative companies, meant more than any reaction from a small-minded middle manager ever could. The next morning, I dressed with special care, a sleek navy blazer over a simple white blouse, tailored trousers, and the good leather shoes I usually saved for client meetings. Today deserved a power outfit. At the office, I printed my resignation letter and headed straight for Richard's office. His assistant, Melissa, looked up from her computer. "He's on a call right now. Do you want me to let him know you're waiting?" "It's fine," I said, handing her an envelope. "Could you make sure he gets this when he's free? It's my 2 weeks' notice." Melissa's eyes widened. "You're leaving? But you've been here for 3 years," I finished for her. "It's time for a change." Word of my resignation spread quickly. By lunchtime, most of the engineering department had stopped by my desk with questions. Where was I going? Had I been poached by a competitor? Was I starting my own company? I'm pursuing some independent projects, I told them, which was technically true. The non-disclosure agreement with Apple prevented me from sharing details until the acquisition was publicly announced. Richard summoned me to his office at 2 p.m. He closed the door behind me, resignation letter in hand. I have to say, Jessica, this comes as a surprise. Is this because of yesterday's meeting? Because if you're that sensitive to constructive criticism— Not at all, I interrupted calmly. I've been considering new opportunities for some time. Yesterday's meeting simply confirmed that my professional goals no longer align with Meridian's direction. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying me. You've received another offer. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. I have several promising paths ahead of me. Which company? He pressed. Google? Microsoft? I should warn you that their corporate cultures can be quite different from— I appreciate your concern, I said, but my plans are confidential at this stage. A flash of annoyance crossed Richard's face. He wasn't used to not getting his way. Well, you'll need to complete a comprehensive knowledge transfer before you leave. Your current projects, documentation, client relationships, everything needs to be properly handed over. Of course, I've already started preparing transition documents. Richard drummed his fingers on his desk. You know, Jessica, the job market is more volatile than you might realize. Jumping ship without a solid plan could be risky. I smiled. I'm comfortable with the risks I'm taking. Is this a negotiation tactic? He asked suddenly. Because if you're looking for a raise or promotion, this is hardly the appropriate approach. I'm not negotiating, Richard. I'm resigning. The finality in my voice seemed to finally convince him. His expression hardened. Very well. HR will conduct your exit interview next week. Until then, I expect you to maintain Meridian standards of excellence in your remaining duties. I wouldn't consider anything less, I assured him, rising to leave. As I reached the door, Richard called after me. The technology industry is smaller than you think, Jessica. Professional reputations matter. It sounded remarkably like a threat, but I simply nodded and left his office. Little did he know how dramatically my professional reputation was about to change. The next week passed in a blur of knowledge transfers, documentation, and quiet goodbyes to colleagues I genuinely respected. Richard maintained a cool distance, occasionally making pointed comments in team meetings about loyalty and seeing projects through to completion. I took it all with a gracious smile, counting down the days. My final day at Meridian Tech arrived with little fanfare. A few coworkers took me to lunch. Marcus gave me his personal email, encouraging me to stay in touch. By 5 p.m., I had turned in my badge, laptop, and parking pass and walked out of Meridian's glass doors for the final time. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. According to Linda, Apple would announce the acquisition of my patent the following Monday, alongside a press release about their commitment to developing innovative accessibility technologies. My name would be mentioned as the inventor and new addition to Apple's R&D team. By this time tomorrow, Richard would know exactly what he had dismissed as impractical and fantasy. The Monday after my resignation started with a text from Emma. Have you seen it? It's everywhere. I hadn't even gotten out of bed yet. Throwing off my covers, I grabbed my laptop and navigated to Apple's newsroom page. There it was, the headline that validated years of late nights, sacrifices, and determination. Apple acquires revolutionary gesture recognition technology in $50 million deal. The press release was better than I could have imagined. It described my technology as groundbreaking and transformative, with potential to fundamentally change how people with mobility limitations interact with technology. There was a quote from Apple's CEO praising the elegant solution to a complex problem and expressing excitement about incorporating the technology into future products. And there, in the third paragraph, was my name. Jessica Chen, the brilliant engineer behind this innovation, will be joining Apple's Accessibility Technology division. My phone exploded with notifications. LinkedIn connections I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly wanted to catch up. Former classmates sent congratulatory messages. Tech blogs were already publishing articles analyzing what this acquisition might mean for Apple's product roadmap. I closed my laptop and took a deep breath. The validation felt overwhelming, like a wave crashing over me after years of swimming against the current. For so long, I'd worked in silence, my abilities questioned and my ideas dismissed. Now my name was trending in tech circles, my invention celebrated as visionary by the very industry that had overlooked me. But the message I was most curious about still hadn't arrived. Richard Parker, my former boss, had surely seen the news by now. What was going through his mind? Was he stunned? Angry? Embarrassed? Part of me wanted to know, while another part recognized that his reaction no longer mattered. I had moved beyond needing his approval. I spent the morning responding to messages and fielding calls from tech journalists seeking comments. By noon, I decided to venture out for coffee, curious if the world looked different now that my professional life had transformed so dramatically. The barista at my regular cafe greeted me the same as always. The sun still shone with the same brightness. Austin's traffic remained predictably frustrating. Fame in tech circles, it seemed, didn't change the fundamentals of daily life. As I waited for my latte, I overheard two people at a nearby table discussing the Apple announcement. $50 million for a gesture system? One said skeptically. Seems excessive. Not if it works as advertised, her companion replied. Think about the accessibility applications alone. That's a massive, untapped market. I smiled to myself, resisting the urge to join their conversation. This was just the beginning of discussions about my technology, and I wouldn't be present for most of them. The invention now belonged to the world in a way it hadn't before. My phone rang as I left the cafe. Unknown number. I almost declined it, but curiosity won out. Jessica Chen speaking, I answered. Jessica, it's Marcus Wei from Meridian. The CTO's voice sounded strained. I think we need to talk. I paused on the sidewalk. Hello, Marcus. I'm guessing you've seen the news? Everyone has seen the news, he said with a nervous laugh. The office is in complete chaos. Richard called an emergency executive meeting first thing this morning. I can imagine, I said neutrally. Jessica, why didn't you tell me? I could have advocated for your project. We could have developed it at Meridian. I found a bench and sat down, gathering my thoughts. With all due respect, Marcus, you were in that meeting last week. You heard how my ideas were received. You didn't speak up then. The silence on the other end told me the point had landed. That's fair, he finally admitted. I should have said something. I just didn't realize the full scope of what you'd created. That's the problem with Meridian, isn't it? Always underestimating potential until someone else recognizes it first. Marcus sighed. Richard wants to talk to you. He's been trying to reach you all morning. Of course he had. I'd blocked his number the day after my resignation. What does he want? To make things right, I think. He's claiming there might be intellectual property issues since you developed the technology while employed at Meridian. I had anticipated this. I developed it entirely on my own time, with my own resources. Nothing in my employment contract gives Meridian any claim to independent projects created without company resources. That's what I told him, Marcus said. Look, off the record, this is the biggest wake-up call Meridian has ever received. You've exposed a fundamental flaw in how we evaluate innovative ideas, especially from women? I supplied. Yes, he admitted. From women? From younger team members? From anyone who doesn't fit Richard's idea of what an innovator looks like. I appreciated his honesty, but it didn't change the past. I hope Meridian learns from this. For the sake of all the talented people still working there, would you consider meeting with Richard? Not for legal reasons, but to provide closure, for both of you. I considered the request. Part of me wanted to decline, to let Richard stew in the consequences of his dismissive attitude. But another part recognized that confronting him directly might be cathartic, a formal end to that chapter of my professional life. I'll meet him, I decided. Not at Meridian, somewhere neutral, and I'll bring my lawyer. That's fair. I'll let him know. After ending the call, I sat on the bench for a while, watching people pass by. My life had fundamentally changed, but I was still processing what that meant. The money would grant me freedom and security, but the validation, having one of the world's most innovative companies bet on my vision, that was the true victory. My phone buzzed with a text from Linda at Apple. Hope you're enjoying your moment. When can you come to Cupertino to meet the team? The future was calling. But first, I had one last piece of unfinished business with the past. We arranged to meet at a downtown restaurant neutral territory with enough privacy for a potentially tense conversation. I arrived early, selecting a corner table with a good view of the entrance. My lawyer, Priya Sharma, sat beside me, reviewing notes on her tablet. Remember, she advised, this is not a negotiation. Meridian has no legal claim to your patent. This meeting is a courtesy, nothing more. I nodded, grateful for her presence. Though I felt confident in my position, having professional backup eased my nerves. At precisely noon, Richard Parker walked in, followed by a man I recognized as Meridian's legal counsel. Richard had aged 5 years in the week since I'd last seen him. His normally immaculate appearance showed signs of strain. Slight shadows under his eyes, tension around his mouth, his tie slightly askew. He spotted me and straightened his shoulders, attempting to project his usual confidence as he approached. Jessica, he greeted, extending his hand. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I shook his hand briefly. Richard, this is my attorney, Priya Sharma. Introductions completed, we all sat down. An uncomfortable silence settled over the table until the waiter came to take our drink orders. I requested water only, wanting to keep a clear head. I'll get right to the point, Richard began once the waiter left. First, congratulations on your deal with Apple. It's quite an achievement. The word seemed physically painful for him to pronounce. I simply nodded, waiting for what would come next. However, he continued, there are some concerns about the development timeline of your technology. As you know, Meridian's employment contract includes provisions regarding intellectual property created during your tenure with us. Priya shifted slightly beside me, ready to intervene, but I placed a hand on her arm. I wanted to handle this myself. Richard, I said calmly, my patent application clearly documents that development began before my employment at Meridian. All prototyping and testing were conducted using my personal equipment, in my private residence, outside of work hours. Not a single line of code was written on Meridian computers or during Meridian time. You never mentioned this project during your employment, he countered. I did, actually. Multiple times. I have dated meeting notes where I proposed gesture recognition concepts that were consistently dismissed as impractical and unmarketable. I pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. These are copies. My lawyer has the originals. Richard didn't touch the folder. Those were general concepts, not specific implementations. The concepts I presented align perfectly with the patent I was simultaneously developing. After repeated rejection from Meridian, I chose to pursue the project independently. Richard's legal counsel leaned forward. Ms. Chen, we're not necessarily disputing your right to the patent. We're simply trying to establish whether Meridian deserves any consideration given that the conceptual groundwork occurred during your employment. The conceptual groundwork occurred during my master's program at MIT, 2 years before I joined Meridian, I corrected. I have my thesis documentation to prove it. Richard's face tightened. This wasn't going as he'd planned. He'd expected me to be intimidated, perhaps willing to negotiate some settlement to avoid conflict with my former employer. Instead, he was facing a thoroughly prepared opponent who had anticipated his every argument. Jessica, he tried again, his tone softening. We could have developed this together. Why didn't you bring the full implementation to Meridian? We could have been partners in this. I couldn't help but laugh, though there was no humor in it. Are you serious? The same technology you called a fantasy last week? The same impractical idea you ridiculed in front of the entire executive team? That technology? He had the grace to look uncomfortable. I may have been hasty in my assessment. You weren't hasty, Richard. You were consistent. For 3 years, you consistently undervalued my contributions and dismissed my ideas. Last week's meeting wasn't an anomaly. It was the culmination of a pattern. The waiter returned with our drinks, interrupting the tension. Richard took a long sip of his scotch, buying time to reformulate his approach. What if, he said carefully, Meridian offered you a position as head of innovation? Complete creative control, double your previous salary, a dedicated team? No, I interrupted firmly. I've accepted a position with Apple. But even if I hadn't, I wouldn't return to Meridian. This is about money then? We could discuss equity options. This was never about money, Richard. I leaned forward, meeting his gaze directly. This was about respect, about recognizing value in ideas that don't originate from the usual sources, about creating an environment where innovation can truly flourish, regardless of who proposes it. His legal counsel whispered something in his ear. Richard nodded reluctantly. We understand your position, he said finally. And after reviewing the documentation you've provided, Meridian acknowledges that the gesture recognition technology was developed independently and outside the scope of your employment contract. It was as close to an admission of defeat as I was likely to get. I nodded, accepting the concession. Is there anything else? I asked, ready to conclude the meeting. Richard hesitated. Off the record, he said, signaling to his lawyer to put down his pen. I underestimated you, Jessica. I made assumptions about your capabilities that were unfounded. Yes, you did, I agreed simply. For what it's worth, I regret that. Not just because of how things turned out, but because it represents a failure in my leadership. His admission surprised me. I had expected defensiveness until the end, not this glimpse of self-awareness. It didn't erase the past, but it suggested that perhaps some good might come from this situation for future Meridian employees. Thank you for saying that, I replied, softening slightly. I hope Meridian can learn from this experience. As we prepared to leave, Richard asked one final question. The technology, is it really as revolutionary as Apple claims? I smiled. It's better. You'll see when they release the first implementation next year. Walking out of that restaurant felt like shedding the final weight of my time at Meridian. Richard's acknowledgement, however reluctant, had provided the closure I needed. Now I could focus entirely on the future. Over the next few weeks, my life transformed at a dizzying pace. I flew to Cupertino to meet the Apple team I'd be working with, brilliant engineers and designers who treated my ideas with the respect they deserved. I purchased a modest but beautiful house in the hills outside Austin, my permanent base while I split time between Texas and California. I established a scholarship fund for women in STEM at my alma mater, determined to create opportunities for others facing similar barriers. The media attention gradually faded, but the impact of my story lingered in tech circles. I received emails from women engineers around the world sharing their own experiences of having ideas dismissed and asking for advice on persevering. Each message reinforced my determination to use my new platform to advocate for change in the industry. One evening, about a month after the Apple announcement, I received an unexpected email from Sarah, a junior engineer who had worked on my team at Meridian. The subject line read simply, "Thank you. You probably won't believe this," she wrote, "but Meridian has completely overhauled its innovation evaluation process. All project proposals are now anonymized for initial review to reduce bias. Richard has been meeting with department heads to discuss creating a more inclusive environment for creative thinking. Your departure forced a company-wide reckoning that has been long overdue." She continued, "Yesterday, my gesture-based user interface for industrial applications was approved for development. 6 months ago, it would have been dismissed as too experimental. The executive who championed it specifically referenced not wanting to miss the next Jessica Chen breakthrough. Your impact here continues, even in your absence." I sat back, processing this unexpected development. My intention had never been to transform Meridian, only to prove the value of my own ideas. But perhaps the most meaningful victory wasn't the patent or the Apple deal, but this ripple effect that might make the path easier for those who came after me. That night, I opened my laptop and began sketching concepts for my next project. The gesture recognition system was just the beginning. I had a notebook full of ideas that had once been dismissed as impractical fantasies, and now I had the resources and platform to bring them to life. As I worked into the early hours, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The rejection had been painful, the long nights of solitary work exhausting, the self-doubt sometimes overwhelming. But looking back, I wouldn't change any of it. Each dismissive comment had strengthened my resolve. Each closed door had forced me to find my own path. Sometimes, being underestimated is the greatest gift your critics can give you. It allows you to work in the shadows, free from scrutiny and interference, until you're ready to step into the light with something undeniable. My gesture recognition system wasn't just a technological breakthrough. It was proof that innovation often comes from the voices least expected to provide it. The following week, I received an invitation to deliver the keynote address at Next Wave, one of the tech industry's most prestigious innovation conferences. The theme was Overlooked Genius, Finding Innovation in Unexpected Places. It was an opportunity to share my story with a broader audience, to inspire others who might be working on their own revolutionary ideas in basements and spare bedrooms across the world. Standing in my home office, looking at the framed copy of my patent, on the wall I felt a surge of purpose. My journey from dismissed employee to celebrated innovator wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a blueprint for others facing similar obstacles. The road ahead would bring new challenges, new critics, new doubts. But I had proven to myself and the world that belief in your vision, backed by persistence and methodical work, could overcome even the most entrenched skepticism. The next morning, I drafted my keynote speech, opening with the words that had guided me through the darkest moments of my journey. Sometimes, the most powerful ideas are the ones everyone else is too comfortable to see. My story wasn't just about proving Richard wrong. It was about proving myself right. And in the end, that made all the difference. The lights of the San Jose Convention Center dimmed as I took a deep breath, waiting in the wings of the massive stage. Through the gap in the curtains, I could see the audience of over 3,000 tech professionals, entrepreneurs, and students settling into their seats. The giant screens displayed the Next Wave conference logo, pulsing with subtle energy that matched my racing heartbeat. "Our next speaker," announced the conference host, her voice carrying through the hall, "has become a symbol of innovation against the odds. 6 months ago, few people knew her name. Today, her technology is reshaping how we think about human-computer interaction. Please welcome to the Next Wave stage, Jessica Chen." The applause washed over me as I walked out, my steps measured and confident despite the butterflies in my stomach. The spotlight felt warm on my skin, illuminating the journey that had brought me to this moment. I took my position center stage, surveying the sea of faces, some curious, others admiring, all attentive. 6 months ago, I began, my voice steady. I was sitting in a conference room much smaller than this one, watching my boss call my ideas stupid. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the audience. Today, I'm here to tell you why that might have been the best thing that ever happened to me. For the next 40 minutes, I shared my story, not just the highlights that had made headlines, but the messy, difficult parts that had shaped me. The late nights questioning my sanity as I drained my savings into prototypes. The moments of crushing self-doubt when respected colleagues dismissed concepts I knew were viable. The strategic decision to keep developing in secret rather than fighting a system designed to overlook voices like mine. Innovation doesn't always come from the expected sources, I told the rapt audience. Sometimes it emerges from the corners of the room, from the people who've been told no so many times they've stopped asking for permission. I moved to the heart of my message. The tech industry talks endlessly about disruption, but often resists it from within. We celebrate the mythology of the lone genius but fail to recognize genius when it doesn't match our preconceptions of what it should look like. On the screens behind me, a series of images appeared. Grace Hopper working on early computing systems, Katherine Johnson calculating space trajectories at NASA, Annie Easley developing software for Centaur rocket systems, women whose contributions had been overlooked or minimized in their time, only to be recognized as foundational years later. What innovations are we missing today because we're not listening to the right voices? I asked. What world-changing ideas are being dismissed in conference rooms across this valley right now? The silence in the hall was profound. I could feel the weight of reflection, perhaps even self-examination, from an industry that prided itself on forward thinking, but often replicated the same biases and blind spots of the past. My gesture recognition technology wasn't revolutionary. Because of some magical insight, I continued. It was revolutionary because it came from a perspective that hadn't been given space at the table. I approached the problem as someone who had watched her grandmother struggle with touchscreens after her stroke, who had friends with mobility issues frustrated by interfaces designed for perfect dexterity. I demonstrated the technology live. For the first time, the cameras capturing my subtle hand movements and translating them into actions on the massive screens. The interface responded to the smallest gestures, a slight pinch to zoom, a gentle twist of the wrist to rotate, a simple finger curl to select. For those with limited mobility, it meant the difference between technology that fought against their capabilities and technology that adapted to them. The audience broke into spontaneous applause as I navigated a complex application using just the micro movements of my fingers in the air. This system works because it was designed by someone who was listening to needs that the mainstream market wasn't hearing, I explained as the clapping subsided. And that's the real lesson of my journey. Innovation thrives at the edges, not the center. I shifted to the more personal aspects of my story. When Apple acquired my patent, many people focused on the number, $50 million. It's a life-changing sum, certainly, but the true value wasn't monetary. It was validation, proof that believing in your vision despite constant dismissal isn't delusion, it's determination. As I spoke about persistence, I noticed movement. At the back of the hall, a figure slipping in through the main doors, trying to remain inconspicuous while finding a seat. Even from the distance of the stage, I recognized the distinctive silver hair and authoritative posture of Richard Parker. My former boss had come to hear me speak. For a split second, I faltered, unexpected emotions surging through me. Then, I gathered myself, drawing strength from his presence rather than distraction. How fitting that he should witness this moment. The employee he had underestimated now commanding the attention of the industry's most influential gathering. The road from dismissed idea to revolutionary innovation isn't smooth, I continued, finding my rhythm again. You'll face skeptics at every turn, Sometimes they'll be competitors, sometimes they'll be colleagues, sometimes they'll be the very people tasked with nurturing your potential. Without looking directly at Richard, I addressed the reality he represented. When authority figures dismiss your ideas, you have three choices: abandon them, fight endlessly for recognition, or find another path forward. I chose the third option. I recognized that convincing my detractors was less important than proving my concept. I moved toward the conclusion of my talk, wanting to leave the audience with actionable insights rather than just my personal triumph. So, what can we learn from this? If you're in a position of power, a manager, an investor, a team lead, ask yourself, what voices am I not hearing? What innovations am I missing because I'm filtering ideas through my limited perspective? The next breakthrough in your field might be sitting in your next meeting, being proposed by the person you're least likely to listen to. I paused, letting that sink in. And if you're that person, the one with the idea that keeps getting dismissed, remember this: rejection is not failure. It's redirection. Let it guide you to either improve your concept or find the people who will recognize its value. Your vision doesn't need universal approval to be valid. It just needs to be right. The final slides displayed the early prototype of my gesture system, a crude assembly of sensors and circuit boards that had occupied my dining table for months, alongside the sleek, refined version now being integrated into Apple's product ecosystem. From this, I said, gesturing to the homemade prototype, to this, the difference isn't just engineering refinement, it's the power of perseverance, of believing that your crazy idea might just change the world, even when everyone else calls it stupid. I stepped back from the podium, the spotlight still bright on my face. Thank you. The audience rose in a standing ovation, the applause thunderous and sustained. As I acknowledged the response with a grateful smile, my eyes found Richard in the back of the hall. He wasn't clapping, but he wasn't leaving either. He stood still, watching, his expression unreadable from this distance. In that moment, I realized I no longer needed his validation or even his regret. His presence was simply the closing of a circle, a witness to the journey we had both participated in from opposite sides. Whatever he took from this moment was his to process, not mine to manage. Backstage, I was greeted by Linda Zhang from Apple, who had flown in specifically for my keynote. "That was remarkable, Jessica," she said, giving me a quick hug. "You didn't just tell your story. You created a manifesto for overlooked innovators everywhere." "I hope it resonates beyond today," I replied, still riding the adrenaline high of the presentation. "It will," she assured me. "We're already getting social media reports. You're trending in 17 countries." Before I could process that information, a staff member approached with an iPad. "Ms. Chen, we've had an unprecedented response to your talk. There are already over 200 requests for interviews, mentoring, speaking engagements, and partnership opportunities. The conference organizers are asking if you'd be willing to do an impromptu Q&A session in the main hall. They've never had this kind of immediate reaction to a keynote." I glanced at Linda, who nodded encouragingly. "Your story is what people need to hear right now," she said. "This is bigger than Apple or the technology itself." Taking a moment to collect myself, I agreed to the Q&A session. As we prepared to return to the stage, I spotted a familiar face among the backstage crew. Sarah, the junior engineer from Meridian who had emailed me about the changes there. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" She smiled, looking both nervous and excited. "I applied to volunteer at the conference months ago. I never imagined I'd see you speak. You were incredible out there." "Thank you. How are things at Meridian?" Her expression turned thoughtful. "Different. Better, I think. My project is moving forward, but more importantly, the culture is shifting. People are listening to each other in ways they never did before." The stage manager signaled that we needed to return for the Q&A. "We should catch up properly later," I told Sarah, squeezing her arm gently. Back on stage, I settled into a comfortable chair opposite the conference moderator, ready for questions. The first came from a young woman near the front, her hand shooting up the moment the floor was opened. "Your story is inspiring," she began. "But what would you say to people who don't have the educational background or technical skills you had? Is this path to innovation only open to those with elite credentials?" It was an excellent question that pushed beyond the surface of my narrative. The specific path I took required technical expertise. Yes, I acknowledged. But the principles apply universally. Innovation isn't about credentials, it's about perspective. Some of the most transformative ideas come from people who approach problems from unexpected angles, precisely because they haven't been trained in conventional thinking. I elaborated. My MIT degree opened certain doors, but it was the experience of watching my grandmother struggle with technology after her stroke that gave me the insight for the gesture system. Personal experience, empathy, and observation are innovation tools available to everyone, regardless of formal education. The questions continued, ranging from technical inquiries about the gesture system to broader themes about workplace culture and gender dynamics in tech. I answered each one candidly, neither downplaying the obstacles I'd faced, nor presenting my success as a simple formula others could replicate exactly. About halfway through the session, a man rose from the back of the hall. Even before he spoke, I knew who it was. The moderator pointed to him, and Richard Parker's voice carried clearly through the space. "Ms. Chen," he began, formal and controlled, "you've spoken eloquently about the importance of companies recognizing innovation from unexpected sources. What specific structural changes would you recommend for organizations that want to avoid missing the next breakthrough like yours?" The hall went quiet. Those familiar with my story recognized the significance of this moment. My former boss, who had dismissed my ideas, now publicly asking for my professional advice. I met his gaze across the distance. "Thank you for the question," I said evenly. "I'd recommend 3 specific changes. First, implement blind review processes for new ideas, where concepts are evaluated without knowledge of who proposed them. Second, create dedicated resources for employees to develop independent projects, even those outside the company's immediate focus. And third, build diverse evaluation teams that include people with varied backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives." I continued, warming to the topic. But beyond structural changes, there's a more fundamental shift needed in how we think about innovation. We need to cultivate genuine curiosity about ideas that challenge our assumptions. When our first instinct is to explain why something won't work, we need the discipline to ask instead, what would it take to make this work? That question opens possibilities rather than closing them. Richard nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "Thank you," he said, and sat down. The exchange hadn't been confrontational as many might have expected. Instead, it felt like the professional respect that had been missing from our previous relationship, a recognition that regardless of our past, we both had contributions to make to the conversation about innovation. As the Q&A concluded, I was approached by countless attendees, students seeking advice, entrepreneurs sharing their stories of perseverance, executives interested in consulting arrangements. But the conversation that stayed with me most came later, in the quiet of the conference center's garden courtyard where I had retreated for a moment of peace. "Jessica." I turned to find Richard standing a respectful distance away, his conference badge hanging around his neck, his usual commanding presence somehow subdued. "Richard," I acknowledged, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I almost didn't come," he admitted. Pride is a powerful deterrent. But I decided that learning was more important than comfort. I gestured to the bench beside me, and he sat down, leaving space between us. "Your talk was illuminating," he said after a moment. "Not just about the technology, but about the blind spots many of us have developed. Thank you for saying that. I owe you an apology, he continued. Not just for dismissing your ideas, but for creating an environment where you felt you couldn't develop them openly. That represents a fundamental failure of leadership on my part. His words surprised me with their sincerity. This wasn't the defensive, controlling Richard I had known at Meridian. What made you come to that realization? I asked. He looked out across the courtyard, gathering his thoughts. After you left and the Apple announcement broke, I was angry. Felt betrayed, if you can believe that. He gave a self-deprecating laugh. As if I had some claim to loyalty after how I'd treated your contributions. That's a common reaction, I observed. When we've misjudged someone, it's easier to blame them for our misjudgment than to acknowledge our error. Exactly, he nodded. But then something happened that forced me to see things differently. The board brought in consultants to evaluate our innovation processes. During their review, they uncovered that Meridian had dismissed at least 7 potentially breakthrough ideas in the past 5 years. Your gesture system was just the most dramatic example. This revelation was fascinating. 7? 7 that we could clearly identify. Who knows how many others never made it past initial conversations because the proposers were discouraged from pursuing them further. He rubbed his forehead. We calculated the potential market value of those missed opportunities. The total came to over $500 million. I let out a low whistle. That would get any executive's attention. It got mine, Richard agreed. But what really changed my perspective was reviewing the data on who had proposed these overlooked innovations. 85% came from women, people of color, or employees under 30. People who didn't fit the profile of who I subconsciously considered innovative. His candor was unexpected but welcome. That's a powerful pattern to recognize. It was humbling, he admitted. I've built my career on identifying market opportunities others miss. Yet I was systematically blind to the value right in front of me because of who was presenting it. We sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the conference continuing in the distance. Meridian has implemented all 3 changes you suggested in your answer to my question, Richard said eventually. We actually started the process months ago, after the internal review. Hearing you articulate them so clearly today confirmed we're on the right track. I'm glad, I said sincerely. Not for myself, but for the talented people still at Meridian who deserve to have their ideas recognized. Richard turned to face me directly. I don't expect forgiveness, Jessica. My actions cost you years of potential career advancement and recognition. But I want you to know that your departure has catalyzed real change. Your legacy at Meridian isn't just the project we missed, it's the transformation you forced us to undergo. The acknowledgement wasn't something I had sought, but hearing it provided a sense of completion I hadn't realized I needed. My time at Meridian hadn't been wasted after all. It had been seed planted that was now bearing unexpected fruit. Thank you for telling me that, I said. Change is what matters, ultimately, not who gets credit for it. As Richard stood to leave, he extended his hand. Congratulations on your success, Jessica. It's well-deserved. I shook his hand, feeling the strange circularity of the moment. Good luck with Meridian's transformation. After he left, I remained in the courtyard, processing the unexpected conversation. There was no Hollywood-style confrontation, no dramatic showdown or emotional breakdown, just 2 professionals acknowledging a difficult past and focusing on a better future. In some ways, that was more satisfying than any scenario I might have imagined. My phone chimed with a message from Linda. Major European Tech Conference wants you as keynote in Paris next month. Interest in your story is going global. Call me when you're free. The momentum was building beyond anything I could have anticipated. My journey wasn't just a personal triumph anymore. It was becoming a catalyst for broader conversations about innovation, inclusion, and untapped potential in the tech industry. As I walked back into the convention center, I passed a group of young women huddled around a laptop, working intensely on what looked like a coding project. They glanced up as I passed, recognition dawning on their faces. "Ms. Chen," one called. Out. "Would you mind taking a look at what we're building? It's a software interface for children with autism, inspired by your work on intuitive gesture recognition." I joined their circle, examining their prototype with genuine interest. The concept was brilliant, adapting my gesture system specifically for nonverbal communication needs, creating bridges where traditional interfaces created barriers. "This is exactly what technology should do," I told them, impressed by their thoughtfulness. "It should expand human capability and connection, not limit it to those who can adapt to rigid systems." The young developer beamed. "That's what we took from your keynote. Technology should adapt to humans, not the other way around." "You've understood perfectly," I smiled. "And your implementation here is innovative in ways I hadn't even considered." As I offered suggestions and encouragement to their team, I realized that this, even more than the keynote or the Apple acquisition, was the real victory. Inspiring others to build on my work, to take it in new directions I couldn't have imagined. Innovation wasn't a solo journey after all, but a relay race where each breakthrough became a baton passed to the next creator. The conference continued for 2 more days, and I found myself constantly surrounded by people eager to share their stories of perseverance or seek advice on navigating obstacles to innovation. Though exhausting, these conversations energized me in unexpected ways. Each person who approached me confirmed that my experience wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger pattern that needed addressing. On the final evening, the conference organizers hosted a private dinner for keynote speakers and industry leaders. Seated between the CEO of a major tech company and the founder of a successful startup accelerator, I found myself in conversations that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. "The industry needs voices like yours," the CEO told me as we discussed the future of accessible technology. "People who understand that innovation isn't just about what's technically possible, but what's humanly necessary. That's precisely why we're establishing the Chen Innovation Fellowship," I revealed, sharing my plans publicly for the first time. "It will provide funding, mentorship, and development resources specifically for innovators whose ideas have been overlooked by traditional channels." The announcement drew enthusiastic support from around the table, with several executives immediately offering to contribute financially or provide mentorship to the program. "I'm allocating 20% of my Apple acquisition to fund the first 5 years," I explained. "But the goal is to create a sustainable ecosystem that identifies and nurtures overlooked innovation wherever it exists." As the evening concluded, I stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking San Jose's cityscape, taking a moment to absorb how dramatically my life had transformed. 6 months ago, I had been a dismissed engineer with an unrecognized breakthrough. Now I was establishing a foundation to ensure others wouldn't face the same barriers. The path from rejection to revolution hadn't been easy or straight. It had required persistence beyond reason, faith during the darkest moments of doubt, and the courage to keep building when no one else believed. But standing here now, looking toward a future shaped by that journey, I knew with certainty that every difficult step had been necessary. My phone buzzed with a notification. The first applications for the Chen Innovation Fellowship were already coming in, hours after the website had gone live. Pioneers with brilliant ideas that had been dismissed, overlooked, or undervalued, seeking the support I had once desperately needed myself. The circle was complete. The rejected had become the champion for other rejected voices. And in that, transformation lay the most profound victory of all. 1 year after the Apple acquisition, I stood in the spacious living room of my Austin home, watching the live stream of Apple's annual product keynote. My heart raced as the CEO paced the stage, building toward the announcement I'd been anticipating for months. "Today," he said, his voice carrying the practiced excitement these events were known for. We're introducing technology that fundamentally reimagines how people interact with their devices. Gesture Connect isn't just a new feature, it's a new paradigm that makes technology truly accessible to everyone. The massive screen behind him displayed the sleek interface I'd spent the past year refining with Apple's design team. As he demonstrated the system, showing how subtle finger movements could navigate complex applications without touching a screen, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just my patent anymore. It was a real product that would soon reach millions of people. And the person who made this possible, the CEO continued, is joining us today. Jessica Chen, the innovator behind Gesture Connect, has a story that reminds us all why we must look for brilliance in unexpected places. The camera cut to where I sat in the audience. I smiled and waved briefly, still somewhat uncomfortable, with public recognition despite the past year in the spotlight. The audience applauded warmly, not just for the technology, but for the narrative of perseverance it represented. Later that evening, as congratulatory messages flooded my phone, I reflected on the journey from concept to worldwide release. The technology that had once been dismissed as impractical and fantasy would now be integrated into every Apple device, creating new possibilities for people with mobility challenges, situational limitations, or simply different preferences for how they interacted with their technology. But the product launch, gratifying as it was, represented only one dimension of what had emerged from my experience. The Chen Innovation Fellowship had grown beyond my initial vision, now supporting 27 innovators whose ideas had been overlooked by traditional channels. We provided not just funding, but mentorship, development resources, and a community of like-minded creators who understood the struggle of pushing against institutional resistance. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Emma, my sister, and now the operational director of the fellowship. "Did you see the numbers?" she asked without preamble. 17,000 applications for the next fellowship cohort. "We've struck a nerve, Jess." 17,000? I repeated, astounded. "That's more than triple last cycle." "Your appearance at the Apple keynote probably helped," Emma said. "But it's more than that. Word is spreading that we're the place where rejected brilliance finds a home." We discussed the logistics of processing so many applications, the additional funding we'd need to expand our support, and the possibility of creating regional hubs to better serve international innovators. "Oh, and the documentary crew confirmed for next week," Emma added before we ended the call. "They want to follow 3 of our current fellows, plus do extensive interviews with you about the whole journey." The documentary had been an unexpected development, a major streaming service approaching me about telling the story behind the Apple acquisition and the creation of the fellowship. Initially reluctant to revisit the painful parts of my experience, I'd eventually agreed when I realized how many others might find inspiration in seeing the complete arc from rejection to revolution. The following week, as the film crew set up in my home office, I prepared myself for the in-depth interview that would form the narrative backbone of the documentary. The director, Priya Sharma, had built her reputation on thoughtful explorations of innovation and the human stories behind technological breakthroughs. "We'll start with the present," she explained, adjusting her chair across from mine. "Then, work our way back through the key moments that brought you here. Don't worry about perfect answers. We want the authentic Jessica Chen, not a polished corporate spokesperson." I smiled at that. Despite the past year's public appearances, I still thought of myself as an engineer first, reluctant public, figure second. Authentic is all I know how to be, for better or worse. The cameras rolled, and Priya began with questions about the fellowship and its mission. I found myself relaxing as I spoke about the innovators we supported and the systemic changes we hope to inspire. "You've created something remarkable," Priya observed. "Not just the technology that Apple acquired, but this entire ecosystem for overlooked innovation. Was that always the plan, or did it evolve organically? I considered the question carefully. Nothing about this journey followed a plan, I admitted. When I was developing the gesture system in secret, my only goal was to prove the concept was viable. The acquisition opened doors I hadn't even known existed, and the fellowship grew. From recognizing how many others faced the same barriers I had. Let's talk about those barriers, Priya suggested. What exactly was happening at Meridian that made you feel you couldn't develop your ideas openly? This was the part of my story I'd been most careful about in public settings, not wanting to seem bitter or vindictive toward my former employer. But the documentary demanded honesty. It wasn't just Meridian, I explained. It was a culture prevalent across much of the tech industry, one that assigns different values to ideas based on who presents them. My direct boss, Richard, was the face of that culture for me, but he was a symptom of a broader problem. I described the pattern of dismissal, the consistent undermining of concepts that didn't align with established thinking, particularly when they came from women, younger employees, or those with less traditional backgrounds. The most insidious part, I continued, was how it made me doubt myself. When respected professionals repeatedly tell you your ideas are impractical, you start to wonder if they're right. The greatest battle wasn't external. It was fighting the voice in my head that had internalized their dismissal. Priya nodded, thoughtfully. Yet you persisted. What gave you the conviction to continue when everything around you suggested you were wrong? 3 things, I replied without hesitation. First, the math. The technical foundations of my system were sound, regardless of what anyone said. Second, personal experience. I'd watched my grandmother struggle with existing interfaces after her stroke and knew there had to be a better way. And third, honestly, stubbornness. I smiled. Sometimes perseverance is just stubbornness with a purpose. The interview continued for hours, covering every aspect of my journey. The technical challenges of developing the gesture system, the strategic decision to patent it independently, the emotional impact of constant dismissal, and the vindicating moment when Apple recognized what Meridian had missed. You mentioned Richard came to your keynote, Priya said toward the end of our session. Have you had any contact with him since? Actually, yes, I revealed. About 6 months ago, he reached out to ask if I would speak to Meridian's leadership team about fostering inclusive innovation. It was unexpected. Did you accept? I did. Not for Richard's sake, but for the people still working there who deserved better leadership. It was one of the most challenging talks I've ever given, addressing the very people who had once dismissed my ideas, now sitting before me, eager for insights. How was it received? I smiled at the memory. With a remarkable absence of defensiveness. They were genuinely committed to change. Richard later told me that after calculating the financial impact of the innovations they'd missed, the board had made inclusive innovation practices a core metric for executive compensation. Nothing motivates change in corporate culture like tying it to bonuses. As the interview concluded, Priya asked one final question. If you could send a message to someone out there right now who has an idea that keeps getting dismissed, what would you tell them? I thought for a moment, wanting to offer something more substantial than generic encouragement. I'd tell them that rejection isn't evidence that their idea lacks merit. It's often evidence that their idea challenges something fundamental. Revolutionary concepts are dismissed precisely because they threaten established thinking. So instead of taking rejection as a sign to give up, take it as confirmation that you're onto something transformative. After the documentary crew left, I found myself energized rather than drained. Revisiting my journey had reminded me of its deeper purpose, not just personal vindication, but systemic change. The technology mattered, the money mattered, But what mattered most was creating pathways for other overlooked innovators to bring their ideas to fruition. The following month took me to Helsinki, where the European Commission had invited me to consult on their initiative to diversify innovation funding. Walking through the snow-covered streets after a productive day of meetings, I found myself reflecting on how far the ripples from my experience had spread. What had begun as a personal struggle against dismissal had evolved into an international conversation about the sources of innovation we systematically overlook. My phone buzzed with a notification from the fellowship's secure messaging system. Meera Patel, one of our current fellows developing breakthrough water filtration technology, had achieved a significant milestone in her prototype development. Her message included a video of contaminated water flowing into her system and emerging crystal clear on the other side, using a fraction of the energy required by existing methods. I smiled, remembering how Meera had described being laughed out of investor meetings because her approach contradicted conventional filtration theory. Now, with the fellowship's support, she was proving that the conventional wisdom had been wrong all along. Her technology had the potential to address water crises in regions where energy-intensive filtration was impractical. This was the true measure of success, not my own vindication, but the cascading effect of creating space for other visionaries to overcome the barriers I had faced. Each breakthrough by a fellowship recipient validated the mission more powerfully than any personal achievement. Returning to my hotel, I found an email from Dr. Sanjay Gupta, the neurologist who had been working with early access to the Gesture Connect system for patients recovering from stroke and traumatic brain injuries. The subject line read simply, "You need to see this." The attached video showed an elderly man with limited mobility using subtle finger movements to communicate through an adapted interface. His family members stood around him, tears in their eyes as he expressed complex thoughts that had been trapped inside him since his stroke 8 months earlier. "Your technology has given Mr. Rodriguez his voice back," Dr. Gupta wrote. "We're seeing similar results across our trial group. This isn't just an interface innovation. It's liberation for people who have been isolated by their physical limitations." I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, tears welling in my eyes as I watched the video again. This was why the long nights, the rejection, the doubt, and the struggle had been worthwhile. Not for the acquisition sum, not for the recognition, but for Mr. Rodriguez and countless others like him, whose lives would be transformed by technology that might never have existed if I had accepted the dismissal of my ideas. The next morning, I received an unexpected call from Linda at Apple. "We've been approached by 3 major tech companies wanting to license Gesture Connect for their platforms," she told me. "They're finally recognizing that accessibility isn't a charity feature. It's an essential design principle that benefits everyone." This was a significant shift. For years, accessibility features had been treated as costly add-ons with limited market appeal. Now, partly because of the success of Gesture Connect, the industry was beginning to understand that designing for diverse needs created better products for all users. "The licensing board is meeting next week," Linda continued. "As the original patent holder, your input would be valuable. Can you join?" I agreed, recognizing that expanding the technology across platforms would increase its impact exponentially. The goal had never been exclusivity. It had been transformation. 2 days later, back in Austin, I met with a group of computer science students from the University of Texas who had requested a mentoring session through the fellowship's educational outreach program. Sitting in a circle in my home office, I listened as they shared their innovative ideas and the resistance they'd encountered from professors and peers. "Everyone says machine learning can't possibly work for this application," explained Zoe, a brilliant sophomore whose accent marked her as a recent immigrant. "But I've run the simulations, and the results are promising. I just can't get anyone to take it seriously." "What does your intuition tell you?" I asked her. She hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "That I'm right, and they're wrong. that the conventional approach is failing because it's based on outdated assumptions about how these systems learn. I nodded, recognizing the conviction in her voice. The same certainty I had felt about my gesture system despite universal dismissal. That intuition matters. It's not proof, but it's a compass worth following. For the next 2 hours, I worked with each student, helping them refine their approaches and develop strategies for advancing their ideas despite institutional resistance. I didn't tell them their concepts were definitely viable, that would require technical validation, but I created space for the possibility that their challenges to conventional thinking might be precisely what made their ideas valuable. As they were leaving, Zoe lingered behind. "Can I ask you something personal?" she requested hesitantly. "Of course. Was there ever a moment when you almost gave up? When the doubt became too overwhelming?" The question pierced straight to the heart of my experience. "Yes," I admitted. About 2 years into development, I hit a technical obstacle that seemed insurmountable. The power consumption was too high for practical application, and I couldn't see a solution. For 3 weeks, I seriously considered abandoning the entire project. What changed? I stopped trying to solve the whole problem at once. Instead, I identified the smallest component I could fix and focused exclusively on that. Once that piece worked better, I moved to the next. Eventually, those incremental improvements led to a breakthrough I couldn't have planned in advance. Zoe nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson. Small victories leading to large ones. Exactly. Revolution happens one solved problem at a time. After she left, I opened my laptop to review applications for the next fellowship cohort. The diversity of ideas was staggering. Innovations in renewable energy, medical diagnostics, educational technology, sustainable agriculture, and dozens of other fields. Each application represented someone who, like me, had faced dismissal but continued to believe in their vision. Among them was a familiar name, Sarah, the junior engineer from Meridian who had emailed me about the changes there and whom I'd met at the Next Wave conference. She had developed a novel approach to energy storage that had been deemed too experimental by Meridian's Innovation Committee despite their reformed evaluation process. Her application video was compelling, clear, technically sound, and addressing a critical need in renewable energy implementation. I flagged it for priority review, knowing the fellowship evaluation team would assess it on its merits without my influence on the final decision. The breadth of overlooked innovation represented in these applications reinforced what I had come to believe deeply, that human ingenuity was abundant, but the systems for recognizing and developing it were fundamentally flawed. The fellowship couldn't fix the entire system, but it could create an alternative pathway for exceptional ideas that might otherwise never reach their potential. That evening, I received a call from Marcus Way, the former CTO of Meridian who had since moved to a leadership position at a major technology incubator. "Jessica," he began after our initial greetings, "I've been following the fellowship's work closely. What you've built is extraordinary." "Thank you, Marcus. That means a lot coming from you." "I'm actually calling with a proposal," he continued. "Our incubator is establishing a new fund specifically for technologies that have been rejected by traditional channels. We'd like to collaborate with the fellowship to create a more comprehensive support ecosystem for these innovators." We discussed the possibilities, how his organization's resources could complement the fellowship's approach, creating a continuum of support from initial concept development through to market implementation. By the end of the call, we had outlined a partnership that could significantly expand the impact of both programs. "I have to ask," I said before we concluded, "what inspired this focus on rejected innovations?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, watching what happened with you. It was a wake-up call for many of us in leadership positions. The idea that we might be systematically overlooking breakthrough innovations because of our biases or rigid thinking. It's haunting. This fund is our attempt to correct that failure." After we hung up, I walked out onto my back patio, gazing up at the stars visible in the clear Texas night. The universe of innovation was vast, with countless brilliant ideas waiting to be recognized. For too long, we had been looking at only a small fraction of that universe, ignoring the rest because it didn't fit our preconceptions of where innovation should come from. The fellowship, the documentary, the corporate partnerships, the speaking engagements, these were all tools for expanding our collective vision, for creating a world where breakthrough ideas could emerge from any source and find the support needed to flourish. My phone chimed with a message from Linda. Gesture Connect user count just passed 5 million. Your idea is officially changing the world. I smiled, remembering the lonely nights working on prototypes in my apartment, the dismissive comments in Meridian meetings, the struggle to believe in my vision when no one else did. The journey from dismissed idea to world-changing innovation had been arduous, but standing here now, I wouldn't change a moment of it. The rejection had forced me to find my own path. The dismissal had strengthened my resolve. The obstacles had shaped the solution in ways that might never have emerged in a smoother journey. What had seemed like barriers had actually been redirections toward a more impactful outcome. As I prepared for bed that night, I found myself thinking about all the innovators out there still fighting for their dismissed ideas, working late in makeshift labs, defending their visions in skeptical meetings, battling the doubt that comes from repeated rejection. They were the true heroes of innovation, persisting not because the path was easy, but because they understood the value of what they were creating. My journey had been just one example of a universal pattern. Transformative, ideas are almost always dismissed before they're celebrated. The challenge for innovators isn't just technical development. It's maintaining conviction when conventional wisdom insists you're wrong. I opened my journal and wrote what had become my personal mantra since the Apple acquisition. The most powerful ideas are often dismissed precisely because of their potential to create change. Rejection isn't evidence of weakness. It's a sign you're challenging something fundamental. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Fellowship applications to review, the Apple licensing meeting to prepare for, a keynote speech to write, for an international innovation conference. But tonight, I allowed myself to simply appreciate how far the journey had come. From a dismissed idea in a conference room to a movement that was reshaping how the world thinks about innovation. The story wasn't just about a gesture recognition system or a $50 million acquisition. It was about the courage to believe in your vision when no one else does. It was about recognizing that sometimes being underestimated is the greatest gift. Your critics can give you the freedom to revolutionize while they're looking the other way. As I drifted toward sleep, I thought about Mr. Rodriguez communicating with his family, about Mira's water filtration breakthrough, about Zoe's determination to challenge conventional machine learning approaches. These were the real victories, the cascading impacts that extended far beyond my own vindication. In the end, the most powerful response to dismissal isn't resentment or revenge. It's revolution, transforming not just your own circumstances, but the very systems that created the barriers you had to overcome. That was the true measure of success. And the journey had only just begun. 3 years after Apple's acquisition of my gesture recognition technology, I found myself standing on a stage that felt worlds away from the conference room where Richard had once dismissed my ideas. The auditorium at MIT, my alma mater, was filled to capacity with engineering students, faculty, and industry professionals gathered for the inaugural Global Innovation Summit. As the keynote speaker, I looked out at the sea of faces. Many of them young women and people of color who had reached out to tell me how my story had inspired them to pursue their own revolutionary ideas despite resistance. Innovation doesn't follow a predictable path, I began, my voice steady and confident in a way that still sometimes surprised me. We like to imagine it as a straight line from concept to creation, but the reality is messier, more challenging, and ultimately more beautiful than that. True innovation zigzags through rejection, detours around dismissal, and often blooms in the dark spaces where no one is watching. The massive screens behind me displayed images of various technologies that had initially been rejected by experts, from the personal computer, dismissed as having no market potential, to digital photography, rejected by Kodak despite inventing it, to touchscreens, considered a novelty with limited applications. The most powerful ideas are often dismissed precisely because of their potential to create change, I continued. They threaten established thinking, challenge comfortable assumptions, and require us to imagine a world fundamentally different from the one we know. That's why rejection isn't evidence that your idea lacks merit. It's often the first sign that you're onto something transformative. As I shared the latest developments in Gesture Connect technology, now used by over 140 million people worldwide and licensed to 17 major tech companies, I marveled at how far the journey had come. The system had evolved significantly through collaboration with Apple's engineering teams and feedback from users with diverse needs. What had begun as my solitary vision had been enriched by countless contributions, becoming something more powerful and versatile than I could have created alone. The real impact of Gesture Connect isn't measured in market share or licensing fees, I told the audience, but in the lives it's transformed. The screen shifted to show video testimonials, a young artist with cerebral palsy creating intricate digital paintings through micro-gestures, an elderly man communicating with his grandchildren after losing speech to ALS, a surgeon controlling medical imaging during complex procedures without breaking sterile field. These were the victories that mattered most, the human connections, facilitated by technology that might never have existed if I had accepted the dismissal of my ideas. After the keynote, I met with a group of student innovators who had been selected to present their projects at the summit. Their energy and brilliance reminded me of myself at their age. Passionate about possibilities, undeterred by conventional limitations, but vulnerable to the crushing weight of dismissal from those in positions of authority. The hardest part isn't the technical challenges, admitted Zara, a doctoral candidate developing an AI system for early detection of neurological disorders. It's defending my approach to professors who insist it won't work because it contradicts established diagnostic models. I recognized the frustration in her voice, the same frustration I had felt when Richard and others at Meridian had dismissed my ideas without truly understanding them. "What does your research tell you?" I asked her. "That the traditional models miss subtle patterns that emerge months or even years before clinical symptoms," she replied without hesitation. "My system can identify these patterns with 87% accuracy in preliminary testing." "Then trust that data," I advised. "Document everything meticulously, build irrefutable evidence, and remember that sometimes you have to stop trying to convince the skeptics and instead focus on proving them wrong through results." Later that evening, at a reception for summit participants, I found myself in conversation with Dr. Eleanor Winters, the newly appointed head of the National Science Foundation's Innovation Pathways Initiative. She had been following the work of the Chen Innovation Fellowship with particular interest. "What you've built goes beyond supporting individual innovators," she observed. "You're creating an alternative evaluation system that recognizes breakthrough potential where traditional channels miss it. That's system-level change." "It's still just a drop in the ocean," I admitted. "For every innovator we support, there are thousands facing the same barriers without resources to overcome them." "That's why I wanted to speak with you," Dr. Winters said. "The NSF is revamping how we evaluate high-risk, high-reward research proposals. Your fellowship's evaluation metrics have demonstrated remarkable success in identifying viable innovations that conventional processes reject. We'd like to implement similar approaches on a national scale." The conversation with Dr. Winters represented something I had scarcely imagined when starting this journey: the potential to transform not Just individual trajectories, but institutional frameworks that determined which ideas received support and which were dismissed. The ripple effects were extending far beyond my personal vindication or even the success of Gesture Connect. The following morning, I flew from Boston to San Francisco for quarterly meetings at Apple headquarters. Though I maintained an advisory role with the company, my primary focus had shifted to the fellowship and advocacy work. Still, collaborating with the engineering teams implementing and expanding Gesture Connect kept me connected to the technical side of innovation I had always loved. Linda Zhang, now Senior Vice President of Accessibility Technologies, greeted me warmly in the sleek lobby of Apple Park. "The medical applications team can't wait to show you what they've done with the neural response integration," she said as we walked toward the research labs. "They've reduced the latency to under 3 milliseconds. In the lab, I watched as engineers demonstrated the latest refinements to the system. What struck me most was how they had taken my foundational technology and evolved it in directions I hadn't imagined, creating applications for surgical robotics, adaptive learning environments, and rehabilitation medicine that extended far beyond my initial vision. None of this would exist if you hadn't persisted when everyone told you it was impossible," Linda remarked as we observed a demonstration of Gesture Connect being used to control prosthetic limbs with unprecedented precision. Or, if Apple hadn't recognized the potential when Meridian missed it, I added. Linda smiled. "That's the thing about revolutionary ideas. They don't require everyone to recognize their value, just the right people at the right time." After the Apple meetings, I had dinner with Marcus Way, the former Meridian CTO who had since become a close ally in the movement for inclusive innovation. His venture fund, EdgeCase Capital, worked in tandem with the fellowship to create comprehensive support for overlooked innovators. "Remember Sarah from Meridian?" Marcus asked as we settled into our table at a quiet restaurant overlooking the bay. "Her energy storage technology just secured Series B funding at a $340 million valuation." I smiled, remembering the junior engineer who had emailed me about changes at Meridian after my departure, and later applied to the fellowship with her own revolutionary idea. "The latest prototypes are exceeding all projected efficiency metrics," I noted. 3 major renewable energy companies are competing for implementation rights. "Another Meridian miss, another Chen Fellowship success," Marcus observed. "The A pattern is undeniable." Over dinner, we discussed the expanding impact of our respective organizations. The fellowship had grown to support 63 innovators annually across 5 global hubs, while Marcus's fund had invested in 27 previously rejected technologies now valued collectively at over $4 billion. "It's not just about finding overlooked innovations anymore," Marcus reflected. "We're changing how the entire ecosystem evaluates potential. Companies that once rejected these ideas are now reforming their evaluation processes to avoid missing the next breakthrough." Including Meridian, I noted. After Richard's departure, Meridian had undergone a comprehensive overhaul of its innovation assessment framework, implementing blind review processes and diverse evaluation teams. The company that had once dismissed my ideas now regularly invited me to speak to their leadership about fostering inclusive innovation. "Speaking of Richard," Marcus said, "have you seen the announcement about Reconsider Capital's new fund?" Richard Parker's transformation had been perhaps the most unexpected development in this journey. After our conversation at the Next Wave conference 3 years ago, he had left Meridian to study inclusive innovation practices globally. When he returned, he founded Reconsider Capital, a venture fund specifically targeting innovations that had been rejected by traditional funding sources. His personal reckoning had evolved into professional reinvention. $28 million for post-rejection innovations, I nodded, and the structured partnership with technical universities to provide validation resources. It's impressive. "From your biggest skeptic to one of your strongest allies," Marcus mused. "That's a plot twist I wouldn't have predicted." The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had once called my ideas fantasy now built his second career on finding overlooked innovations with revolutionary potential. Richard and I had even co-authored a Harvard Business Review article on blind spots in innovation assessment that had become required reading in MBA programs worldwide. The next morning, I flew to Austin to oversee final preparations for the fellowship's annual innovation showcase. The event had grown from a small gathering in our first year to a globally recognized platform where fellows presented their breakthroughs to potential partners, investors, and industry leaders. At our headquarters, a converted warehouse in Austin's East Side, the energy was electric as fellows rehearsed presentations and finalized demonstrations. Meera Patel was calibrating her water filtration system, which now provided clean water to communities across 3 continents at 1/10 BT, energy cost of previous methods. Zoe Chen, no relation, was debugging the final version of her machine learning framework that had upended conventional approaches to pattern recognition in medical imaging. "Jessica," called a familiar voice. I turned to see Emma, my sister, and the fellowship's operational director, approaching with a tablet in hand. "The documentary team just sent over the final cut for approval. They want to release it ahead of the showcase." The dismissed had been an unexpected development in my story. A major streaming service approaching me about telling the journey behind the Apple acquisition and the creation of the fellowship. Initially reluctant to revisit the painful aspects of my experience, I'd eventually agreed when I recognized how many others might find inspiration in seeing the complete arc from rejection to revolution. "Also," Emma continued, "Richard just confirmed he'll be on the Second Chances in Innovation panel. Are you sure you're comfortable with that?" I nodded. "It's important to show that this isn't about villains and heroes, but about transforming systems that limit human potential. Richard's evolution is part of that story." The relationship between Richard and me had evolved into something neither of us could have predicted. Not friendship exactly, but a productive alliance based on shared commitment to fixing the flawed systems we had both participated in from opposite sides. His public acknowledgement of how bias had clouded his judgment carried weight with executives, in ways my criticisms alone never could. That evening, I met with the newest cohort of fellows for our traditional welcome dinner. 16 innovators from 11 countries, each with a breakthrough idea that had been repeatedly rejected by conventional channels. Looking around the table at their faces, nervous, excited, determined, I saw reflections of myself 3 years ago, standing in that Meridian conference room watching Richard dismiss the technology that would later transform millions of lives. "Before we begin," I said, raising my glass, "I want you to know something important. You've been selected for the fellowship not despite the rejection your ideas have faced, but partly because of it. Revolutionary concepts are almost always dismissed before they're celebrated. The pushback you've encountered isn't evidence of weakness in your innovations. It's often a sign you're challenging something fundamental." I saw relief in their expressions, the validation of knowing their struggle wasn't unique or indicative of some flaw in their vision, but rather a common experience in the journey of transformative innovation. "The fellowship isn't just financial support and mentorship," I continued. "It's a community of people who understand what it means to believe in something that others can't yet see. We've all stood where you're standing, defending ideas that challenged conventional wisdom, pushing forward when the experts said to stop." After dinner, a young woman named Aisha approached me privately. Her innovation, a decentralized diagnostic system that could detect multiple conditions from a single drop of blood without laboratory infrastructure, had been rejected by 27 investors before the fellowship accepted her. "How did you maintain conviction when everyone said you were wrong?" she asked quietly. There were moments I almost believed them, almost gave up. It was the question at the heart of this journey, the challenge every revolutionary innovator faced. "I anchored myself in 3 things," I told her. "The technical fundamentals that I knew were sound, regardless of others' opinions. The real human need I was addressing, my grandmother's struggle with technology after her stroke, and a stubborn belief that if I could build it, its value would become undeniable. I placed a hand on her shoulder. The most important thing is to distinguish between helpful criticism that can improve your innovation and dismissal that comes from limited vision or resistance to change. The first makes your idea better. The second just tests your resolve. Aisha nodded thoughtfully. My system works. The preliminary field tests proved it. I just couldn't get anyone to look past the fact that it contradicts established diagnostic protocols. Build it anyway, I advised. Create evidence that can't be ignored. The fellowship exists to give you runway to reach the point where rejection turns to recognition. The following day brought final preparations for the showcase, with fellows, fine-tuning demonstrations and rehearsing presentations. In the midst of the controlled chaos, I received an unexpected message from Dr. Sanjay Gupta, the neurologist who had been among the first to implement Gesture Connect in rehabilitation medicine. Thought you should see this before it's published, he wrote, attaching a preprint of a comprehensive study on Gesture Connect's impact in neurological rehabilitation. The results exceeded even the most optimistic projections. 78% of patients with limited mobility reported significant improvements in quality of life. Communication capabilities were restored for 82% of those with speech impairments, and the system had enabled independence for thousands who had previously required constant assistance. This technology has redefined what's possible in rehabilitation medicine, Dr. Gupta concluded in the paper. What began as one engineer's impractical idea has become the new standard of care, transforming lives that conventional interfaces had left behind. Reading the study, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment that transcended any vindication over those who had dismissed my ideas. This, the tangible human impact, was the true measure of innovation. Not market capitalization or technical elegance, but lives improved, capabilities restored, human potential unlocked. That evening, as final preparations for the showcase continued, I stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The Texas sunset painted the sky in dramatic oranges and purples, a fitting backdrop for contemplating the journey of the past 3 years. From a dismissed engineer working in secret to the founder of a global innovation movement. From a solitary struggle to a community of revolutionary thinkers challenging conventions across dozens of fields. From one rejected idea to a fundamental rethinking of how we evaluate innovation potential. My phone buzzed with a message from Linda at Apple. Gesture Connect user count just passed 140 million. You've officially changed the world. I smiled, remembering the lonely nights working on prototypes in my apartment, the dismissive comments. In Meridian meetings, the struggle to believe in my vision when no one else did. The journey from dismissed idea to world-changing innovation had been arduous. But standing here now, I wouldn't change a moment of it. The rejection had forced me to find my own path. The dismissal had strengthened my resolve. The obstacles had shaped the solution in ways that might never have emerged in a smoother journey. What had seemed like barriers had actually been redirections toward a more impactful outcome. As I watched the sunset fade into twilight, I thought about all the innovators inside the building behind me. Brilliant minds working on technologies that might transform healthcare, energy, education, and countless other fields. Each of them had faced rejection that might have ended their journey if not for the alternative pathway the fellowship provided. This was the true revolution. Not just my individual success or even the specific technologies we supported, but the creation of systems that recognized innovation in unexpected places. The establishment of channels that could capture brilliant ideas conventional frameworks missed. The development of communities that sustained visionaries through the inevitable, resistance revolutionary concepts faced. Tomorrow, these fellows would present their innovations to the world. Some would find immediate recognition, while others might face continued skepticism. but all of them had already overcome the most difficult hurdle: maintaining conviction in their vision despite repeated dismissal. As I turned to go back inside, I thought about the message I hoped my journey conveyed to anyone facing similar obstacles: that rejection is often not evidence of weakness, but a sign you're challenging something fundamental, that revolutionary ideas are almost always dismissed before they're celebrated, that sometimes being underestimated is the greatest gift your critics can give you, the freedom to revolutionize while they're looking the other way. The path from dismissed idea to world-changing innovation is rarely smooth or straight. It zigzags through rejection, detours around dismissal, and often advances in secrecy until the concept is too powerful to deny. But for those with the courage to persist, to believe in their vision when no one else does, to keep building when conventional wisdom says stop, that path can lead to revolutions that transform not just individual careers, but entire fields of human endeavor. As I rejoined the fellows inside, watching them prepare to introduce their revolutionary ideas to the world, I felt the profound satisfaction of having created not just a successful technology or a powerful organization, but a template for others to follow. A demonstration that the journey from rejection to revolution isn't just possible, it's the story of how humanity moves forward. The dismissed idea that Apple bought for $50 million had catalyzed something far more valuable than a financial windfall. It had become proof that sometimes the experts are wrong, that sometimes the revolutionary potential of an idea is precisely why it faces rejection, and that sometimes the most powerful response to dismissal isn't resentment or surrender, but quiet, determined revolution. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.